With everything I've learned, the places I've gone, the design ideas I've seen, I would want to include all sorts of details that I would never have imagined back then. But then I flip open our wedding album and see the smiling faces of the people we love all gathered in that place where we chose to celebrate our special day together. And just as with my engagement ring, any desire for something different or fancier melts away. Our wedding was perfect just the way it was. Everything we cared about was exactly the way we wanted. When I look back, I realize I wouldn't change a single thing. Chip and I got married here in Waco on May 31st, 2003 at the Earl Harrison House, a historic mansion that looks an awful lot like the place where we had our first date, a stately manor with grand pillars and a gorgeous garden. We actually chose the location primarily because of its park-like setting. We wanted an outdoor wedding, and the gardens there were filled with roses. The place was completely covered in flowers, climbing high on grand arbors that our guests would walk under. The setting was so beautiful just the way it was. I didn't need much of a budget for flowers. I loved magnolias even back then, before the shop came along, so we cut individual magnolia leaves for our guests to use as fans. My parents had sat us down shortly after we announced our engagement and made us an offer. They'd been married on the steps of a courthouse, and with that in mind, they'd see they were going to give us a certain amount of money as an upfront wedding gift. We could use that money for whatever we wanted, to throw a nicer wedding than we could afford on our own, although anything would have been more than the wedding we could afford on our own at that point. Or to throw a simple wedding and use that money on a down payment for a home or a honeymoon or whatever we chose. Chip and I decided that we would use that money for the wedding. Since our plan was to move into one of his soon-to-be vacated student rental houses on 3rd Street for the summer, we didn't need extra for a down payment, and Chip's parents had been kind enough to take care of the honeymoon, so we were set. I had no desire for a high-priced designer dress, so I went out shopping with my mom and found one off the rack for about $500. Just a simple, white, Cinderella-looking dress with a lace-up back, narrow at the waist and then flowing out through the skirt. Chip and his groomsmen wore rented tuxedos from the mall. We weren't interested in capturing the latest trends or trying to impress anybody. We just wanted it to be beautiful, and the best way I knew to do that was to stick to a classic, timeless look, so black and white attire with red roses was the palette we chose. Plus, we knew all of those beautiful white roses in the Harrison House gardens would give us the perfect backdrop we dreamed of. The day before the wedding, we went over to the property for the rehearsal, and I just about died. The estate had pruned all of the roses. They were gone. Every last one of them. There was nothing there but empty stems. The arbors, the arch over the altar, everything was just leaves and thorns. Sadly, it just happened to be the time of year to prune the roses. It was a professionally kept garden, like an arboretum, and the time had come. I think they could have waited an extra day or two knowing they had a wedding that weekend, but it was too late to argue. In a last-minute attempt to save the scene, we scrambled to our parents to ask for a flower budget. We bought hundreds and hundreds of white roses and stuck them in bunches all over the arbors and barren bushes, doing our best to fill in a million holes and make it look like the real roses were still there. When I look at pictures now, it may be obvious that those roses had been stuck in by hand, but that wasn't the point. It was honestly almost better that all of our closest friends and family had come together at the last minute and tried to turn this venue back into the place we'd been dreaming about. It really was perfect. Perfect for us, and part of the reason for that is we broke tradition in some ways. For example, Chip insisted that his dog Shiner be in the wedding. We haven't mentioned Chip's dog yet, but that mutt was Chip's best friend. I still swear to this day that he loved that dog more than he loved me. My bridesmaids weren't crazy about the idea of Shiner being a member of the wedding party, but Chip wouldn't budge. Heck, Shiner would have been Chip's best man if he could have stood at the end of that aisle and held those rings. But we compromised and set him up under a gorgeous oak tree so he could be comfortable in the shade as he watched his old man get married. My dad and I arrived at the ceremony by horse-drawn carriage. A trumpeter played us in. We had a little string quartet and a beautiful couple who sang during the ceremony. All of our closest friends were there. It was a day we'll never forget.
I still look back at that as one of the best days of my life. A lot of my friends and her friends met for the first time at our wedding because we were literally from different universes. But they were all so important to us. And I just remembered that all my buddies were like, she has got the sweetest friends. All these people kind of came together and became buddies. You know, it was great. There were all these funny coincidences too. Jo had twins in her wedding party. I had twins in mine. What are the chances of that?
Chip's dad was his best man. My sisters were my maid and matron of honor. The fact that our friends got along so well and that we both put family first were just more signs to me that Chip and I weren't all that different where it counted. There were a lot of similarities between us, and that day seemed to be filled with affirmations of just how much we truly belonged together. The wedding seemed to have a ripple effect, too. My sister, Mary Kay, brought this guy to the wedding that she'd only been on a few dates with. His name was David. Well, she caught the bouquet, he caught the garter, and they wound up getting married, too. How's that for a story? Chip and I started our honeymoon off in New York City, where I had done my internship. One of my favorite things to do when I lived alone in New York was just to walk the streets. There are fascinating landmarks around every corner, people of every culture and background and style you could ever imagine, and so many interesting shops and restaurants. No matter how many times you walk those streets, you would always find something new. One of the most surprising finds to me were the little individual shops and boutiques, whether they were clothing stores or home furnishing stores or gift shops. It was almost as if the owners of those little individual shops had to work extra hard to make sure their businesses could compete with the big chains and expensive stores all over town, and the results were incredible. There always seemed to be a candle burning, filling those shops with a delicious scents. It wasn't unusual to see fresh flowers on the counter next to the register, or for the shopkeeper to offer you a cup of coffee or tea while you browsed. There was something just wonderfully inviting and warm about those places that made me feel very connected in a city that could sometimes feel big and overwhelming. I loved taking Chip to that great big city and showing him a side of me he hadn't seen before. We acted like rich kids and stayed in a suite at the Drake Hotel, a high-end first-class place on Park Avenue that had once played host to celebrities like Frank Sinatra and Lillian Gish. But that was just the starting point for our adventure. We set aside a full 2 weeks for our honeymoon, and other than those couple nights at the Drake, we made no plans whatsoever. We decided to rent a little car and just go wherever the day took us. We headed upstate and marveled as the massive city gave way so quickly to hills and rivers and fields full of flowers. Before long, the tallest buildings around were the silos on old-fashioned farms that dotted the landscape. Chip and I both had an affection for farms and old barns and silos, and we decided it would be fun to go explore. If we saw an abandoned barn, all gray and weathered and tipping over in some empty field, we'd stop and go walk around in it, even duck inside just to see what was there. Occasionally, we'd find old bottles and farm equipment, and I always wondered why someone had just up and abandoned them for all those years. The thing I found interesting was just how beautiful everything looked. The rust, the age, the weathering. Maybe it was just because we were in love, but everything we saw in those old abandoned barns, both inside and out, seemed to capture and reflect the beauty of the land and the air and the early summer scents in that beautiful corner of the world. Even the dust in those old barns seemed to rise up on purpose, helping to illuminate those old forgotten spaces with streams of sunlight that crept through the cracks in the wood. We didn't have Google Maps in 2003, so we spent that honeymoon road trip following our intuition and heeding the attraction of little signs on the side of the road, antiques, or bed and breakfast, or pick your own. We agreed that we would drive until we were both dead tired and then find some place to lay our heads wherever we happened to wind up. On the first night, we ran into this place called the Mohonk Mountain House. We'd been driving along the cliffs of the Hudson River, and then all of a sudden, this hotel made of stone rose up in front of our eyes. It looked just like some sort of medieval castle.
It was late, and we were both exhausted from all this exploring. We both thought maybe we died or something. Is this place for real, or did we just drive off that cliff to get here? It was weird just to cruise into this driveway and have no idea what to expect and then find a place like this.
We wandered into the lobby, half expecting it to be our final resting place. The good news is we weren't dead, and when we told the nice people at the front desk that we were on our honeymoon, they put us up in a gorgeous penthouse suite for the price of a regular room.
People wound up giving us deals like that almost everywhere we went on this trip. It was incredible, and thank goodness, because we were really low on funds.
From there, we decided to continue up into New England, meandering across the Berkshires and western Massachusetts, cutting through the country roads of southern New Hampshire, and heading north to explore as much of the crashing Atlantic on the rocky Maine coast as we could. We stayed off the interstates and took back roads as much as possible, stopping at antique stores and mom-and-pop shops and cute old barns and farmhouses, whatever caught our eye. One night, we stayed in the dreamiest bed and breakfast right on a farm, where we ate fresh eggs and a home-cooked meal in the morning. Both of us agreed, what could be better than that? Before I met Chip, I was basically a city girl, or maybe a suburban girl. As a kid, I lived in a typical cookie-cutter neighborhood in Wichita, Kansas. We lived there until I was 12, while my dad kind of worked his way up the corporate ladder for Firestone. But as a small child, I would often go visit my friend's farm. She had silos that we would play in. I thought that was the coolest thing. My friend hated living out on that farm. She wanted to come play at my house so she could be in the neighborhood, riding bikes with all my friends. But I liked going to her house because it was a farm. We would pretend we were these farm girls that wore aprons, and we'd come up with stories like, hey, let's pretend that Bobby got stuck in the silo. We played so much make-believe at that farm that I feel as though farm living was a part of my past, even though it really wasn't. Driving through the beautiful farmlands along the back roads of New York brought back the memories of my time spent there.
The grass is always greener, right? We were both brought up in these sort of cookie-cutter neighborhoods, but in my case, I loved going to my granddad's ranch. That was definitely where I got the cowboy in my personality. My granddad, J.B., was a bona fide cowboy. He was like the Marlboro Man, literally smoked cigarettes, tall, lean, great-looking dude. Always had this gorgeous cowboy hat on, wore long-sleeve shirts and long pants every day of his life, even if it was 100 degrees outside. He was just one of those iconic characters. I still, to this day, think of him as a hero of all heroes, the legend of all legends. I don't mean to overstate that because my dad was a huge hero to me too. He was the one who was there. He was the one who loved us. He was at every ball game. My granddad wasn't really the doting, overly loving kind of guy, but he was kind of the patriarch of the family, and spending time with him on that ranch made a big impact on my life. I may have grown up in the suburbs like most kids did, but I've always felt like JB and I had a lot in common, and I've always felt like I was born 100 years too late.
For either of us to romanticize farm life was probably a silly thing to do. It's a lot of work. For my friend, living on a farm just meant she had a whole lot of chores to do. But no matter how much I heard her complain, I still thought, that's what I want someday. So having that little taste of farm life on our honeymoon sure felt right to both of us. Days later, somewhere along the woodsy coast of Maine, at around 11 o'clock at night, we had another memorable moment. We were tooling around a corner when Chip slammed on the brakes, squealing to a dead stop. He and I both stared out through the windshield and said, "What in the world is that?"
Luckily, we weren't in a hurry and we weren't driving too fast because right in front of us there was this big, awkward-looking moose right in the middle of the road. Neither one of us had ever seen one in person, and we just could not believe how big this thing was. It was like a dream come true for me to come across that kind of an animal in the wild. Once I realized what it was, I was like, whoa, what should we do? I feel like we should do something. Joe said, let the poor thing go. So of course we did. We watched that majestic beast just wander off into the woods and disappear into the darkness just as fast as he'd shown up in our headlights.
I feel like the moose was our final big find of that trip. We were both tired, and after seeing something that magnificent, we decided it was time to head home. We took a different route down through Boston and realized as we drove through the city that we were basically out of money. We had nothing left. We stayed on the interstates after that and made it back to New York with as few stops as possible, arriving just in time to fly back home.
Joe's idea of being broke was when she had like $1,000 left in her bank account. I wasn't much for bank accounts. I didn't use credit cards back then. So once we got back to Waco, we literally had no money left for a hotel room or anything. We had no choice but to go straight to the vacated rental house we were both planning to move into. The students had just moved out of it while we were on our honeymoon, and it was nighttime when we got back home, so we didn't really have a chance to get in and inspect it or get it cleaned up or anything like that. We just drove in from the airport and pulled up in front of that dreamy little yellow house on 3rd Street, and at the end of this amazing honeymoon of a lifetime, wah, wah, wah.
And Chip carried me over the threshold.